So we've been talking about classical ideals of balance, of symmetry, of clarity, humanism, Enlightenment values. And you might wonder where that all leads. After the death of Beethoven in 1827, you start to see composers very preoccupied with expanding the range of what you can do in music, expanding it quite considerably. Beethoven is an interesting figure in this sense because he really bridges the gap between these two fundamentally different attitudes, the classical style and the romantic attitude. Beethoven is difficult to classify for that reason because his earlier pieces are clearly indebted to Haydn. They exemplify this clarity, this transparency of texture, this measured aspect. And in his later pieces, Beethoven becomes obsessed with the idea of taking any kind of formal constraint of some kind and pushing it to the breaking point, almost to the point where the musical language stops functioning. He wants to push his material as far as it will possibly go. He wants to impose his strong will, his strong personality on the music material. It's a kind of gigantic exacerbation of individual subjectivity. And where that starts to lead is things like the Ninth Symphony. The Ninth Symphony of Beethoven is an absolutely colossal composition. It's a vastly lengthy piece that not only includes a symphony orchestra, but it also includes soloists and a choir and all kinds of new instruments that had not appeared in the orchestra up to that point. Instruments such as the trombone and the piccolo and the contrabassoon and all these new instruments that just drastically expanded the range of colors, the range of sounds that you could have in an orchestra. But the idea that in the middle of a symphony, you would have a soloist stand up and start singing, and then you would have a chorus begin to intone this famous Ode to Joy that we have in the finale of the Ninth. What that did, the effects of that innovation of Beethoven's, were suddenly the form just collapses in a sense. It's like anything can now happen. And that had such profound and far-reaching consequences. Every composer after the Ninth Symphony of Beethoven was then left with a challenge. Well, what do you do after that? What do you do after a piece of music that completely throws open the doors? All bets are off. You no longer know what Beethoven's going to do in his late pieces. It's not just the case in the symphonies. It's the case also in his late string quartets, where suddenly you have this intensely metaphysical reflection upon the nature of music itself. The music becomes increasingly inward, increasingly esoteric, increasingly strange in its developments, increasingly unpredictable as well. The old classical forms are starting to burst at the seams. They can no longer convey, they can no longer contain the turbulence, the violence, the complexity of Beethoven's thought. So while he's still nominally operating within classical forms, they're bursting at the seams at this point. And the composers that followed, the generation after Beethoven, had to respond to this challenge. Because suddenly, it's no longer enough just to write a 20-minute string quartet. Suddenly, the composer is tasked with establishing a new expressive world, with expressing their own individual subjectivity, with a new degree of power, a new degree of force that had not been seen before. So one of the things that starts to happen in the era after Beethoven is that music, in many respects, becomes increasingly distant from anything that you could consider to be a kind of pragmatic, functional dimension. Composers are no longer responding directly to the requirements of their audience or their patrons. They're no longer necessarily even writing music for today. Beethoven considered himself to be writing for tomorrow, for the future. And he was often asked by performers, by audience members, I don't understand this piece. And he'd say, it doesn't matter. You'll understand it later on. If you don't understand it now, maybe your children will understand it. This is a new shift in this artistic attitude. The composer is no longer simply responding to the demands of their time. The composer has become, in a sense, a kind of visionary, someone who is going to be sensitive to things that ordinary people cannot see